This is the narrated PowerPoint on the review of the literature material. Starting with this week's reading, you're reading a chapter of theory, in this case, theory of writing a review of the literature, and then you're also reading an actual review of the literature, which is in chapter 7. And that's the way the rest of your reading will be structured for this book: a chapter of theory, and then an article that illustrates the theory with an actual article. So what is the difference between primary and secondary research? Generally, primary research is gathering data, and then secondary research is writing about that data. Or the person who does secondary research is not the person who does the primary research. They're writing about other people's research or their gathering of data. So the authors address the issue of whether or not secondary research is derivative, and they point out that, primary research can be derivative, and secondary research isn't necessarily derivative. If primary research is flawed in some sense, like if it can't be replicated, and that's very important in scientific studies. That's the reason that you're supposed to be publishing, that your work can be replicated. If it can't be, then there's a problem. Very often, when someone's published work that can't be replicated, they have to withdraw it, or the journal where it was published will withdraw it for them, and it can create scandal. But the secondary research can certainly be important. One that comes to mind is that Ernest Rutherford, who was an early 20th century physicist doing research on the atom. From looking at the research that others had published, he drew the conclusion that there was a good deal of space between the subatomic particles of an atom, like between the nucleus and the protons and so forth. And that was something that people had published studies of the atom experiments without drawing that conclusion. And so that's regarded as an important experiment. If you read about the history of the development of the theory of the atom, you'll still read about Ernest Rutherford's uh, essay on the alpha and beta particles, published in 1911. And so secondary research can certainly be important. In terms of why you review the literature, it establishes your ethos. That is, you're someone who knows what you're talking about because you're familiar with all the important work that's been published on your topic. And the important thing you're trying to do with your review of the literature is to identify gaps in knowledge. And then your work, your article, your dissertation, or your thesis fills in that knowledge. You create new knowledge that is invaluable to others, other researchers who are working in the same area that you are. It doesn't matter whether it's physics or biology or psychology or technical communication, for that matter. You also educate your readers, and your readers don't necessarily know everything about a topic. If you've done exhaustive reading for a thesis or a dissertation, then very often you may know more than they do, even though you're just starting out with your career. But you're also educating them so that they can read and understand the significance of the research that you are then going to present. So what forms might a review of the literature take? It could look like this. This is the first sentence to an article, and you can see that the writer of this article cites 5 different articles, actually 6 different studies um, in the area of cultural studies as they relate to technical communication. And this is appropriate for an article. You don't want to write a tremendous amount in terms of doing your review of the literature for an article. The response you might get from a reviewer might be, "Oh, I feel like I should be reading this article." If you write, even a couple of pages on a single article, sometimes it might be necessary, but it's best to avoid it and to keep references in articles to as brief as possible. On the other hand, a for a thesis or a doctoral dissertation, you would write quite a bit to indicate the extent to which you're situating your topic among the literature that's been written about it. And if you're writing on something that a lot has been written about, say Aristotle or Shakespeare, um, then your review of the literature might be quite long. As a matter of fact, you would probably want to, with something like Shakespeare or Aristotle, you might want to take that and narrow it down to just a particular aspect of the scholarship on those authors, by a particular play or a particular work that you're dealing with, or even a particular subject within those works. Generally, 20 pages is pretty standard for a chapter in a thesis or a dissertation, though it could be that you write quite a bit more than that. Or I had two review of the literature chapters for my doctoral dissertation because I was writing about metaphor, and so I had one where the material was drawn from philosophy and rhetorical theory and linguistics, and another one that just focused on how metaphor had been written about in technical communication. So, to what extent is a literature review a historical document? It is historical because you could be showing how a topic has developed over a period of time. Or I was showing with writing about metaphor how it had changed from writing about metaphor as an object to writing about it as being epistemological. That is, something that is the difference between metaphor is something that is simply decorative, and metaphor is something that is used to create new knowledge, to be epistemological. And so, showing those changes can help to situate your work as well. Where do you fit in? So here's a question. Here the authors reference a book, the St. Martin's Bibliography of Business and Technical Communication, which I have a copy of, published in 1997. Would it hurt or help your ethos as a researcher to start that far back? Well, I think that certainly it wouldn't. It would probably help your ethos to start that far back, unless this is something that has happened since then. But even so, you might go back and look at the roots of it. Like if you're writing about something related to Facebook. Facebook is basically a discussion board. What has been written about discussion boards prior to that? The difference is that in terms of what we can access, it's kind of like a Facebook is kind of like a cross between a discussion board and a web page. You can post videos and things like that, and uh, you know, very nice photographs. But in some ways, it's still a discussion board. And even before people were able to post pictures or videos or anything like that, they still had discussion boards. So it might be a good idea to go that far back, especially in terms of looking for ways of treating something in terms of how you might analyze a topic. The authors say, in terms of answering this first question, should you copy another writer's abstract of an article or should you write your own? They say, oh, sure, just put quotation marks around it. I say, no, don't do that. Don't ever do that. The times when you would want to do that would be few and far between. You want to do your own work. And one reason for doing that, other than it being kind of questionable, and if you did something like that, for example, for an annotated bibliography for a class, I think probably most of you could see that you would probably fail. Um, but there's always the reason for doing your own work is also it allows you to give your own slant to the material, so to better support the tack that you're taking with it. Here's another one that you run into sometimes in terms of talking about. We talk about reviews of the literature. We think about writing abstracts, basically, to some degree. With the sample article, it's not set up as an annotated bibliography, but yet there are distinct paragraphs that summarize single sources. And so sometimes you hear this idea of a descriptive abstract versus an informative abstract. Or you might hear these referred to, the informative abstract referred to as an executive summary. What is the difference? Here's one that I wrote. You can take a minute to read it. I had the opportunity when I was in my PhD program. I had a fellowship from Medtronic, and you might have heard of Medtronic. They're very commonly sponsors of NPR. But the big thing they do is they manufacture different types of equipment that's used in the medical field. The first thing that they manufactured that made them a tremendous amount of money was a pacemaker for a heart. The first one was developed in a North Minneapolis garage in the 1950s. Anyway, the problem, and we'll talk more about this when we get into quantitative research, but the problem that technical writers were having there was they were being required to use the flush reading ease formula to evaluate documents that they were writing for Medtronic, because Medtronic was answering to a government agency that was requiring that the documents that they produced be written on a 6th grade level. And so they were using the Flush-Kincaid formula, which is actually developed here at Georgia Southern by a psychologist named Kincaid back in the 1970s or something. But the Flush-Kincaid is a part of Microsoft Word, and it gives you a score as a grade level. The Microsoft Word also gives you the Flush reading ease, which is a score on a scale of 0 to 100, with in the 90s as being the best. And the Flush-Kincaid gives you a grade level. It gives you something like grade 16, which would suggest senior year of college, right, or even higher. Of course, it can be much lower, and they're being required to write on an 8th grade reading level because that's currently considered to be the average. Well, there's lots of problems with that. One is that the flush reading ease only uses 2 variables. One is the number of words per sentence, and the other is the number of syllables per word, with the idea that longer sentences are going to be harder to comprehend than shorter sentences, and monosyllabic words are going to be easier to understand than polysyllabic words. So, short sentences, short words, easier to understand, causes you to have a lower Flush-Kincaid or a higher flush reading ease score. And so here's an abstract that I wrote for the report that I wrote for Medtronic. Now, this is the executive summary that I wrote, and not all executive summaries are going to be alike, but one thing they have in common is the difference between an executive summary and an abstract is the abstract offers a summary of the work that it's dealing with. The executive summary makes a value judgment about what the reader will find most important and goes into more detail about that. So I thought the readers of this report would be most interested in seeing this other readability formula that I discovered through research and through secondary research, which was the Golub syntactic density score. And you can see that it's a lot more complicated in terms of how it analyzes a piece of writing. And it also comes up with a reading grade level for the score. And we'll go into more detail about this. I'll show you more about how this works and coming up and soon, next week. So here are the differences between the abstract and the executive summary. And the way that what you can also take from this is just in terms of your thinking about how much detail that you would go into. And again, thinking about um, a summary as being more like an executive summary, again, has to do with the slant you're giving to the material, how you're using it to support your thesis. But anyway, here are the differences. So the abstract, generally the length of a good abstract is 10% of the introduction, body, and conclusion, depending on how long it is. I mean, if you've written a 300 page dissertation, probably your abstract is not going to be 10% of that. Probably you'll be told to write something like between 2 and 300 words, something like that. But with an article, a good rule of thumb is 10% of the introduction, body, and conclusion of the article. The length of an executive summary is one full page. And again, this might have more value to you thinking about writing the review of the literature for a master's thesis or a doctoral dissertation, but not for an article. The intent of the abstract is simply to describe what's in the report or describe what's in the article. Your intent with the executive summary is to describe and evaluate for the main object. I said value call you make about what you think the reader will find most important about what you're summarizing or most appealing, or what will best, again, what will best support whatever your intent is, right, to make that impression upon the reader. Generally, an abstract is going to be one paragraph. It might be kind of long, but it's one paragraph. And you think about too about when you're doing your reading in scholarly journals, the abstracts that you read that determine if you want to read the article are generally one paragraph, and they're usually of a fairly uniform length because the editor will require that they be a certain number of words. Okay, for the executive summary, I usually say at least two paragraphs because you figure out what it is your reader is going to find most important or what best supports what you're writing about, and then you go into more detail. And so that going that what you're going to write in more detail about, that needs to be that second paragraph. And this has become, I think, a bit of a problem. Older people generally like to complain about how horrible the writing skills are of younger people. Generally, that's not true. But I will say that I think one problem that social media has created is a tendency for people to write rants. And so they write these long paragraphs, and it's kind of, when you do that, it kind of shows others how excited or passionate or emotional that you are about a topic. And unfortunately, sometimes that gets transferred into academic writing. Generally, and technical communication provides us a good model for this, people are able to better understand passages where you have more shorter paragraphs. So it's a good idea to shift to a new paragraph whenever you significantly shift your emphasis on the topic. And these shifts may occur in terms of time and space. Space in the sense that you're simply looking at something from a different perspective. But generally, shift to a new paragraph when you shift your perspective on a topic. But the executive summary, at least 2 paragraphs. It could be more than 2 paragraphs easily. Generally, abstract doesn't have any headings except for the one up at the top that'll say abstract. The executive summary is usually going to have at least one heading. It can have more than that in the body of the abstract. And again, the headings are good for allowing the reader to easily jump around in a document to find the information that they need easily. And you have to keep in mind that um, it's certainly true for people on the job. They're not reading for fun. They're reading to get information often that they need to act upon. So they need to be able to find it easily. And headings help people to do that. They help to see kind of an outline of a document. The abstract is objective in the sense that it simply describes what is in the document. Now, we know and recognize in technical communication theory that whenever a human being sits down to write something, they're going to put more emphasis on one aspect than another. You're going to get a particular perspective when you read what someone else has written. But the abstract is objective in the sense that it does stick to describing what is in the article. The executive summary is subjective again because of that decision about what the writer thinks the reader will find most important, or what what the writer may think they need to best support their perspective. But again, that's action on the reader when you're thinking like that. Okay, to shift gears to the example essay in chapter 7, this is a good example of a review of the literature essay and also for its content. In terms of its content, if you've taken the editing course, you've probably been introduced to the idea of corporate style guides, and this is when a corporation has jargon terms that are used, perhaps, or it could even be spellings. Um, when I interned for a telecommunications company when I was working on my master's degree, and they had this is up in North Carolina's Research Triangle Park, which is adjacent to the Raleigh Durham Chapel Hill area, which you know for ACC basketball, if nothing else. But they had a number of different facilities in the area, and one was called the Commerce Center. It was a sales center where they bring people in from all over the world to sell them on. This was an early iteration of transition from analog to digital communication. And the name of the center was the Commerce Center, and they spelled center CENTRE. And literally, my first day on the job, I was given some material to proofread, and I saw that spelling, so I changed TRE to TER because I recognized that as a British spelling. And then my supervisor was looking over what I had done, and she came into my cubicle and said, "Oh, you can't do that. Don't ever do that." She said, "If they saw this in Canada, they would hit the ceiling that you changed the spelling." And the reason is that Northern Telecom was headquartered in Canada. It was a Canadian company, and of course, Canada was a province of England for a longer time than the United States was, and they still retain a lot of British spellings. So it's the way in which they review the literature about corporate style guides is certainly worth reading about if you're interested in technical communication and about establishing ones. A lot of good information. So anyway, one question I have here is should or shouldn't review of the literature have a thesis? And the reason that I have this question here is that sometimes there are some people who think that reviews of the literature shouldn't, that the intent of the review of the literature should be apparent because it should show that there's a hole in the knowledge, and so therefore you don't need a thesis. Well, I'd like to point out that this one does have a thesis. It occurs later than you usually think of a thesis as occurring because because it is fairly long. Generally you're taught to have your thesis in the first paragraph, and this one is actually on it's on the first page, but it's one, two, three. It's actually the fourth paragraph, the beginning of the last paragraph on 110. Um, and then you can also, the rest, that paragraph continues over on the next page and offers support for that sentence. So I would say yes, especially with an article or a chapter, you definitely need a thesis. And again, that helps you out with being able to support whatever idea it is you're trying to support. So, or to give your spin on that particular idea. Could this essay have been structured differently? Certainly, it could have been. It could have been done as an annotated bibliography. And when you think of that, typically you think of like a list of abstracts with the bibliographical citation above it, and that's fine. A lot of times the way that's taught is that you just have a list of sources. That's fine in terms of moving from there to using them in a research paper or something. But the way that works in terms of publishing articles is that it's more like this one. And that is, you notice that the way that the authors use headings throughout this piece for the different sections of this article that they've written about corporate style guides. Again, for people to be able to survey and to see where the different sections are so they can get information. Of course, people who read on the job aren't reading for entertainment, they're reading to find information that they often have to act on. So those headings are definitely helpful. Uh, I have seen published annotated bibliographies where they do have um, the bibliographic citation in the article, rather than at the end. But they still have they do things like what they do in this article, where they have sections, and they have like the beginning of a section there might be an introduction to the articles that are in that section, and then perhaps a conclusion to each section that also provides transition to the next one, as we see in this one. So yeah, different ways this could have been structured, but again, some of the basic ideas with technical communication, of having the point of the document be clear, and then good organization, and that organization clearly visible through headings, are apparent here as well. Questions? I'll see you online.